presenting to this conference. And Professors Gray Morning and Andrus, thank you so much for your organizing efforts. My name is George Bisharat. I teach at the University of California, Hastings College of the Law, which is in San Francisco. However, I live in the East Bay. So I begin by recognizing that I speak from the territory of Huichin, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people, the successors of the sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. And this land was and continues to be of great importance to the Muwekma Ohlone tribe and other familial descendants of the Verona Band who are alive and flourishing members of the local community today. My title, as you are aware, is Private Violence in the Settler Colonial State. By that I mean threats or actual application of physical violence, not just discursive or metaphorical violence. And by actors other than state officials, so not the army, not the police, but rather private individuals. In the context of settler colonialism, which, as I know you're aware, is a specific form of colonialism involving substantial displacement of indigenous peoples in favor of settlers from elsewhere. And I'm not just interested in any private violence, I'm specifically interested in violence by settlers against the indigenous population. Now, my working hypothesis is that this kind of private violence is not merely an incident of settler colonialism, something that just happens, but rather is integral to it and that it serves systemic functions. I'm not the first to make this claim. There are others, such as the Australian anthropologist Patrick Wolfe, who stated this very strongly, although Australian, he was speaking in relation to the United States. And then there are other Australian scholars who have also argued this in respect of the settlement of Australia. What I add is, first of all, that this may also be that the central role or the integral role of private violence in settler colonial projects is also true of Palestine, including in the contemporary period. And I also argue that it may be true of most, if not all, settler colonial projects. My own research focuses on Palestine, and one advantage of that is that it affords us an opportunity to actually observe settler colonialism unfolding in real time. But ultimately, the objective is to expand the scope of the research to include other regions of the world. Now, I want to begin with two short vignettes. The first of them occurred in 1982 when it was between my second and third years of law school, and I had received funding from the law school to work as a student intern for the first Palestinian human rights organization, which was called at that time Al-Qanun min Ajl al-Insan. It was later changed, the name was changed to Al-Haq, which means right or justice, and is still functioning, by the way. So part of my assignment that summer was to investigate allegations of Israeli settler violence against indigenous Palestinians in the West Bank. So I toured around gathering stories, testimonies from Palestinians about their experiences of violence at the hands of Israeli settlers. One afternoon, I was with another colleague, and we were interviewing a man, maybe 50 years old, who I will call Abu Munif. And Abu Munif lived in the Palestinian village of Silwad, which is outside of Ramallah, kind of heading north toward Nablus. And he told us about an incident that had occurred several weeks before, in which Israeli settlers who were from the settlement called Afra, which was nearby, came in the middle of the night, and they, with chainsaws, sawed down 20 of his olive trees and then a similar number of grapevines. And he had reported this to the police, but nothing had happened. And then a few weeks after that, the same settlers, he assumed, showed up with a bulldozer and appeared to be starting to plow a road through his orchard. So he and his son tried to stop them physically, and for their efforts were beaten, both with moderate injury. Now, by the time we arrived, Abu Munif held in front of us a document which was an expropriation order from the military governor, the Israeli military governor of the region, saying basically that that his land had been expropriated for purposes of constructing a roadway to Ofra, to the Israeli settlement. So I should mention that Ofra itself had been started not under any Israeli legal authority, but by the private initiative of these settlers who went and took over an abandoned army outpost and just kind of set up shop there. In the end, what happened was that the settlers who had initiated the land seizures and the seizure necessary to the outpost and to the to the roadway to it, their actions were retroactively legalized by the Israeli government. That's one vignette. The other one has to do with it occurred here in California in the mid-19th century, and it involves Sir Honest Hastings, the man who endowed the law school where I have taught for the last 30 years or so. Sir Honest Hastings came to California in 1848, 1849 as part of the gold rush. Although he himself was never a miner. He had been a Supreme Court Justice of the state of Iowa. He had also served in the House of Representatives, the U.S. U.S. Congress. So he was a fairly eminent person. And rather than going out and dirtying his hands in the rivers and other places where people were mining, he was appointed the first Chief Justice of the state of California. He later served as Attorney General for the state. And then he went into private legal practice and began also land speculating. He would buy land and then sell it at a profit. And he did this repeatedly, and he amassed significant wealth. He became one of the wealthier people in the state of California and owned tens of thousands of acres. Now, at one point, he had purchased, I don't know from whom, I don't have the documentation for that, but he had apparently purchased a lot of land constituting virtually the entire Eden Valley, which is in Mendocino County, north of San Francisco. And at the time, there were approximately 600 members of the Yuki people, Yuki native people, who were living there. Hastings hired a militia headed by a man by the name of William Jarboe, who apparently was a physical giant and a renowned Indian killer. He hired a militia and basically organized the forceful displacement, killing, and enslavement of the Yuki peoples of that region. This was a process that was going on elsewhere, and the Yuki, the surviving Yukis and other members of other tribes were concentrated in basically a reservation in a nearby region. And I will spare you the gory details. And in this case, I'm not speaking. I'm not using that term as a metaphor. There are accounts of the violence that was committed against the people by Jarboe and they were called the Eel River Rangers. And they're awful. They're as bad as you can imagine. Terrible, terrible massacres of native Yuki men, women, and children. Now, is there anything linking these two vignettes? Any common threads that connect them despite their distance in time and place? I believe so. I'm going to start with similarities. There are some significant differences that I hope to be able to touch on as well, but let's start with the similarities. And forgive me if this sounds a little bit like a laundry list. In the interest of time, I may not be able to elaborate on each one of these, but let me see if I can at least get through the list. So first of all, both of these vignettes unfold in a broader context of settler colonialism, which, as we have already noted, is a form of colonialism that involves violent displacement of indigenous settlers in significant numbers. I didn't perhaps say violent the first time I defined it, but natives never go willingly, so in fact settler colonialism is always violent. Now, in California, in the period from roughly 1848 to 1873, the native Californian population was reduced from somewhat over 300,000, I think it was 310,000, to fewer than 20,000. And this was particularly as white labor flowed into the state in large numbers because of the gold rush, and as dependence on Indian labor, which had been quite a factor in the economy of California prior to the gold rush, diminished. So there was a shift in the availability of white labor. Indian labor was then dispensable, and frankly, it was dispensed with. So that's the big context is settler colonialism. A second similarity is that neither of these vignettes were unique. In fact, they were emblematic or representative of broad, and in the case of Palestine, continuing trends. Third, violence in both cases served two purposes: land seizures and repression of native resistance. And in the latter category in California, I include killings or thefts of livestock. And I may be able to come back and explain that further. Next, these vignettes or these historical events occurred within a surrounding ideology of racism. The idea of the positive virtues or entitlements of one group, the settler group, coupled with a belief in the negative traits of others, and in particular that the indigenous people were essentially violent savages, and their violence was in their nature or in their culture, not a response to settler colonialism. Next, there was also, in both of these circumstances, extreme official violence. So there was private violence for sure, but there was also extreme official violence in both cases by agents of the state, by the militaries of both states. Now, there was native resistance in each case for sure, but the numbers of casualties have always been, or in both cases were, and in other examples as well, vastly disproportionate. So relatively few settler injuries and deaths, and huge numbers by comparison of native indigenous deaths. You saw this in the Gaza Strip just this last May. Now, partly this has to do with technological military arms disparities, but just because you have superior arms doesn't mean that you have to use them. So in both cases, what we see are very deliberate policies of what historian Benjamin Madley, speaking of California, referred to as pedagogic killings. The purpose of the violence is not just to, for example, kill perpetrators, the persons who may have stolen and killed a cow or maybe assaulted a settler. The purpose is to teach the natives a lesson. So the killings and other violence were categorical and collective, and like I said, did not necessarily seek out individual perpetrators. In California here, for example, if some, they called them often depredations. If some native depredation occurred, then a white militia would go out and wipe out an entire village, not necessarily even the village from which the perpetrator was suspected of originating. So it was just a categorical against the native population. And you see a number. I could give you perhaps in the discussion a number of examples of collective punishment in Palestine today, and deliberate, articulated policies of disproportionate violence. In both cases, again, this extreme official violence models or sets an example for private violence, essentially saying that native lives are not worthy. There's more. I wish I could have time to go through all of these, but I think I better. I'll just mention one more similarity, which I think is important to understand, which is that both of these settler colonial projects, California, the United States, and Israel today, are self-imagined liberal democracies with some level of commitment to the rule of law. And in neither of these two cases was the outright slaughter of natives ever legally permissible. Always there have been voices of restraint and of conscience and legal restraints on authority against mass killings. Now, I'll just mention a couple of important differences and then go on and try to state my conclusions, because I know I'm running short on time. But clearly, so here's a significant difference. Clearly in California, whether you take a lay definition or you take a legal definition, I think you could make an argument that genocide occurred here. Genocide, of course, is a modern post-World War II legal concept, but if you took the elements of the crime and applied it to California, as actually Benjamin Madley has done in his book, American Genocide, I think you can make a powerful argument that this was genocide, and that's not what's going on in Palestine today. You had mass ethnic cleansing, you had people driven out in huge numbers, but we don't have mass killings. Obviously, another difference is that the one example is historical. In the case of California, it occurred in the mid-19th century, and the other is more recent and is an example of ongoing trends, even with in the 21st century. And let me just say again, because we're running short, what we're talking about here is a vastly transformed legal, ideological, political landscape, and Israeli settler colonialism is unfolding under a kind of scrutiny that was not true of 19th century colonialism in California. And that, of course, imposes a number of restraints on Israeli settler colonialism that people here in California did not face. And it necessarily forces settler colonialism into less violent, more bureaucratic forms. Now, let me conclude, because I know my time is almost up, with a couple of observations, suggestions about what role private violence has played historically and perhaps is playing in contemporary Palestine. Basically, I would say that there is a quantitative dimension whereby private violence increases the number and range of cases in which violence can be used against the indigenous population, beyond that which the state and its agents are capable of fielding. There is also perhaps a qualitative dimension, and I'll have to explain this, I think, in discussion, but essentially there is often, not always, but often, a greater horror to private violence. It can be very personal, it can be very extreme, it can be very brutal, as compared to the relatively more regulated and legally channeled forms of violence used by the state. So essentially, private violence expands the scope of opportunities to use violence in service of the settler colonial project, again, either to seize land or to repress native resistance, while providing a certain deniability to the liberal democratic state. I'm almost done. Now, does this merely state the obvious? Possibly an audience like this one might understand what I've said fairly intuitively. However, I think what is obvious perhaps to this audience is not necessarily obvious to everyone. And I think the frequency of private violence in settler colonial projects through time and across space strengthens the inference that it's not accidental. It makes it more possible to identify it as a deliberate policy of the settler colonial project. It diminishes the space for the deniability of the state's denying of responsibility for that private violence, and hopefully strengthens our hand in stopping it in real time. Thanks so much.